When we think of the word fat, we loathe it with intensity. We associate it with everything grotesque and monstrous, things that a human should be morally opposed to being. We don't examine it. When the origin of the word obese was coined, meaning to literally eat oneself fat, it occurred during a period when Europe considered fat to be sinful, corpulent but also ravenous, despite Renaissance paintings portraying it favorably. Only those with power benefited, while those without it starved. Food was a symbol of means, while a fuller body, in many civilizations, was associated with abundance. That changed with new class access and colonization. When black and brown colonized bodies were introduced into Europe's public consciousness, their bodies were at the intersection of spectacle and disgust, in a post-feudal age that suddenly became capitalist within a century or two. The colonized people that replaced white serfs as a workforce created a new subclass that the upper classes could create new distinctions for. Despite obvious genetic variation, bodies of slaves were seen as sinful. They were deeply othered and dehumanized, and new traits Europeans had seldom seen. Thick, coarse, or tightly spiraled kinky hair, paired with rounder faces, stouter or taller limbs, and deep, richly toned skin, were both exotic and nightmarish. They were now a point of reference for characteristics that one should avoid having if they wanted to climb social ranks. Don't be dark, and don't be fat. The manufacturing of whiteness was the birthplace of eugenics in the West. When eugenics was rampant in the 1800s, an astronomer with no background in medicine named Adolphe Quetelet created a way to measure fatness in all human beings by using the Nordic soldiers in his country as a reference, known as the Quetelet Index. Inspired by a mathematical perspective, he believed that fit white men were exceptional, and if he created a universal equation using them, you'd find an easy way to hack to good health. He later admitted that his system was flawed and couldn't do what he claimed. 200 years later, weight loss companies and health insurers use this method known as the BMI to raise health premiums and influence policy to get hospitals to recommend weight loss pills to anyone a fake math equation said was fat. The 19th century was also a pivotal period that combined eugenics with the growing influence of Protestant movements. The lingering effects of the Reformation inspired a new emphasis on individual choices by purifying the body to bring one closer to God. The logic, namely through an American lens, was that it was easier to be faithful if you were free of sin. Since fat had developed in the lexicon to link larger bodies with excess and hedonism that characterized black and brown bodies implicitly, many health practices that later contribute to a culture of eating disorders developed. Eating as little as possible, eating to be thin, avoiding animal processed foods because it was believed that it had helped the body avoid disease, and food's equation with sin, because it's pleasurable, became a deeply rooted Western ideology. Similarly, in countries where colonialism and imperialism were and are rampant, social scientists have found that Western attitudes and locals towards their own bodies and food have impacted how they see themselves and influence their dietary choices. For example, after the island nation Fiji found a reliable electricity distribution center around 1995, waves of influence of Western media rolled through the country after televisions became commonplace, and there were reported increases in eating disorders amongst young girls. Fiji had long since associated food and larger bodies with eating well and prosperity, but within 3 years of exposure to Western beauty standards, Harvard researchers interviewing teenage girls found that they'd suddenly detested their larger bodies, thinking that they were too fat, and picked up bulimic habits to purge themselves of it. By 2007, the country had culturally fully assimilated. Under the Western gaze, and older generations considered it positive that young women could move up in the world, despite coming at the expense of said generation's self-esteem. To them, it was a way of making it off the island. Similarly, if we look at Japan around this time period and correlate its boom in economic growth during the 90s, increasing its westernization, there is a distinct rising trend in eating disorders and people living in metropolitan areas. It's as if the overexposure to the image of what capitalism tells you what you should look like in order to be successful can take a toll on your health overall. Other countries like Pakistan, different parts of Africa, and Singapore have research that mirrors these trends. The fear of fatness on a global scale is the fear of socioeconomic stagnation. Within a capitalist and imperialistic context, food restrictions, starving, and purging aren't only moral goods, they fit into a greater agenda to eliminate diversity. They're unifying cultures based on standards set by the conqueror class. And then when you link the deeper implications of fat being associated with blackness, poverty, and all things subhuman, you find an intersection of a deeper complexity of issues that every country faces in regards to it. Each country's relationship to fatness and colorism is shaped by how they were carved out by white and oppressive power structures. The hatred of fat bodies, or useless eaters, that past and present Nazis referred to disabled and neurodivergent people as, is the perseverance of eugenics. The concept of the right food versus the wrong food also has roots in colonizers altering the diets of colonized people by forcing them to eat European staples, such as in Africa with maize via Britain, and in Latin America from Spain with livestock, and creating an elaborate hierarchical way of determining if they were healthy, based on bodies and diets that weren't theirs. This process is also called food imperialism. It's retooling of health by setting up the parameters to fit a universalized standard that's based on what rich white people make up to be healthy, would continue to evolve to our present understanding of food groups. While a lot of emphasis is leaned towards the political, military, and economic changes forced upon the colonized people, the matter of food, the very source of survival, is seldom considered. Yet food has always been a fundamental tool in the process of colonization. Through food, social and cultural norms that are conveyed, and are also violated. Indeed, one cannot properly understand colonization without taking into account the issue of food and eating. Food is inherently political. So what are the rules of consumption? The BMI was introduced into the late 20th century as a quick and dirty way to determine that. Historically, colonized countries were forced to assimilate by altering their diets to match what colonizers wanted to use to civilize them and become less indigenous and more white, so settlers wouldn't dirty their palates and suddenly turn black and brown. This process still occurs, but when the BMI was brought to the table by Ansel Keys, an American physiologist hired by the US Department of War to study the effects of food deprivation in men, him citing inspiration from the Quetelet Index wasn't a coincidence. Keys admitted to finding fat bodies ugly, clumsy, repugnant, and hard on furniture, and some of his more notable work was devoted to finding a link between obesity and potential health concerns that included surveying populations across the globe and attempting to correlate larger and fatter bodies with heart disease, even though the relationship has a variety of sociological factors involved and is complex. His obsession with these correlations proved invaluable for policymakers and weight loss companies. When the BMI criteria for overweight and obese began seeing serious fluctuation between 1985 and 1995, investigation by researchers and health professionals showed that the World Health Organization and an international obesity task force that was formed to consult it were funded by the makers of weight loss drugs Xenical and Meridia. Uncoincidentally, the 80s were also a period when Reagan deregulated big industries, including Big Pharma, and healthcare saw an explosion in insurance costs. The World Health Organization was also responsible for changing the metric for obesity overnight in 1998, and it resulted in an instantaneous shock to the system, where millions of people were seen as unhealthy in the eyes of the system within a 24-hour period. This messy change in policy affected 29 million people overnight in the US alone. Under the new guidelines, 97 million adults, nearly 55% of the US population, would be considered overweight, placing them at increased risk of such health problems as diabetes, elevated blood cholesterol, heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure. And uncoincidentally, 1998 was also the year that saw a sharp spike in private healthcare spending, 6.9% to be exact, and overall healthcare spending rose to over $4,000 per person, amounting to a 1.1 trillion increase overall, especially on prescription drugs, which was in the billions. Obesity in particular experienced a sudden spike in medical costs for maintenance, diagnosis, and drugs, which meant insurance companies could bet on payers having higher rates of issues correlative with heavier bodies, in an oversimplistic sense: high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease. One widely quoted estimate from Finkelstein and colleagues, based on data from the US Medical Expenditure Panel survey, found that obesity was responsible for about 6% of medical costs in 1998. Or about $42 billion in 2008 dollars. When obesity became a worldwide phenomenon and quickly considered to be a disease, alarmism, the perseverance of incorrect but convenient health metrics like the BMI, and policymakers being paid to create a social boogeyman out of fat, numerous industries saw an insurmountable amount of profit. The public and the world at large saw fat as a cultural cancer. It also became so necessary to see fat as an ongoing problem that it begs the question of how businesses can make money like they used to without it. If you pay attention to the upward trend in increasing alarmism over the war against obesity, similar to the war against drugs, it's only a Trojan horse for more nefarious purpose, exploiting innocent people perceived to be dangerous to make money. FYI, the phrase war against obesity was a term that started going around in 1999. If you've been paying attention to the timeline here, It's also uncoincidental. There are constant concerns posted to us that ramp up public anxiety that we're actually getting fatter. In reality, however, research that weight loss companies and policymakers ignore repeatedly assert that weight loss isn't feasible long term. It's great for raking in a lot of money for people that want a 5 to 10% drop in weight for a short period of time, say up to 4 or 5 years. There's numerous examples most people have seen of their friends, family, and different faces in the media documenting rapid weight loss within 6 months to a year or more. They go on a cleanse, eat clean, go vegan, cut out bread and meat, and start maniacally exercising and see huge transformations. They're enviable to many of us. But then you follow up with them a decade later, or even a few years later, and they've mysteriously managed to gain most, if not all of it back, and tend to be much heavier than they started out with on average. And they've most likely tried several times to jump back on the wagon, and their weight starts fluctuating. They've slimmed down by summer because one of their coworkers put them on some new diet, but then by the following spring, they've stopped posting selfies as frequently, and you see them and they're right back to where they started, and they're clueless as to how they got there. There's just an emptiness and a feeling of helplessness as they chase that high again of finally defeating the cultural cancer to be overweight, and implicitly sad, broke, single, and unhappy. Fat people aren't happy. Fat people aren't prosperous. They don't get chosen by their love interests in real life or in the media. They're not the protagonists. They're not on Playboy or GQ. They don't have social capital. They're not who you want to date or marry. They don't get called snacks when in positions of power. They're not notable, memorable, worthy, productive, pure, healthy, good, or moral. They're hideous, beastly, subhuman. Maybe the Nazis that were inspired by American eugenics had it right. Maybe we're all meant to be thin and fit because that's what all the advertisements, doctors' recommendations in hospitals, and health policies say are good for us. We're not influenced by centuries of equating fat with excess. Even though metabolism is complex, and something as simple as stress from capitalism and lack of access to good healthcare can affect it, we're not influenced by the conqueror class's descendants, being today's billionaires, CEOs, politicians, and ruling class who invest in stock that bleeds the exploited labor like plantations with fresh decor and new management. We don't punish ourselves for not reaching our goal weights for accidentally eating junk food with a relentless self-loathing, purging, or breaking ourselves back like the good little workers at the gym because an endorphin rush is a sufficient reward for cleansing the sin we've brought onto ourselves. We forget to eat most of the day because we're working overtime, but it's okay. Our stomachs eating themselves and our hearts eating their own muscle is okay. A post on Instagram said that intermittent fasting is actually a good thing. It's okay. If we work hard enough, we'll get there. Even if we fail, we'll just keep trying. Even if we're not really meant to win because there's trillions of dollars invested in this cycle. And that know that humans can't successfully beat their biology without actually being the causes of their heart disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, and issues associated with weight, but are actually because of the rinse and repeat cycle of capitalism and white supremacy therein. And that bodies are inherently flawed and imperfect, and many diseases that reside in us are genetic. Turns out that it's not weight in and of itself that causes disease in most cases. It's weight cycling and the constant process of jumping on the horse, freaking out your body because of all the sudden changes, starvation and so on, falling off of it and your body regaining through recovery, then jumping back on the diet train again that wreaks havoc on it. It's too easy to accept that our bodies are different from one another. Radical even. Accepting that body diversity is a reality that we've been morbidly obese since before Christ came into the picture, and that the portrait of fitness shouldn't be defined by Nordic soldiers because everyone has different fat distribution. It's almost as if that bias is intentional, especially by those that get a high off of getting into the sciences and start thinking that they can simplify how we see human diversity. But there's no money in that, and we're trying to keep the races pure, or for race betterment. That's what John Harvey Kellogg, founder of Kellogg's, believed anyway, who had and has a huge influential shadow over medicine and nutrition, in addition to the food industry. While the US became obsessed with the Protestant ideologies during the 19th and 20th century, a large number of trailblazers that set the foundation for these industries, especially in health, were fanatical about purity. Kellogg believed that good nutrition would cure disease, and used agricultural metaphors to justify his views, while being a vocal and powerful eugenicist. And that's a lie we're still sold. It's the oversimplification and reliance on easy and natural solutions that supposedly can rid the world of its perceived ills that make us think that we can have better lives if we just got up and put down the money to find them. Even though this system sets you up to fail every time. There is data with 50 years worth of study showing that diet and weight loss long-term aren't possible for most people. And researchers keep finding evidence that all of these fad terms in health we hear about, calories, superfoods, intermittent fasting, cleansing, etc., are all multi-billion-dollar lies. And there's no end to the rabbit hole of which weight loss company or health insurance company influences which organization or government task force, and that bariatric surgery was designed to kill you for a buck. Then, most popular weight loss pills are flagged by the FDA, or go by unnoticed and wind up being recommended by doctors, which also can deny you access to an accurate health diagnosis, because they've both learned and are told that fat is the source of all impurity. It happens so often that it's become a huge issue that's received some media attention, because doctors are legally able to kill fat people by not giving them a diagnosis when they ask for it, because the patient's obligated to lose weight, which on average, studies show aggravates pre-existing conditions and is ultimately worse for them. All because of those policies that were botched, relying on eugenic math equations and poorly tested data, pushing the agenda that fat can actually kill us all if we let it. When we see the phrase body positivity, I think we've grown a bit numb to it. It's plastered everywhere, and most people nowadays know logically that dieting is bad, and don't realize it that it's been repackaged, making lifestyle changes that still come in the form of starving yourself, whether it's for Christ or for your weight loss goals. It's also been recently attacked for being neoliberal, which isn't completely wrong, but it more so applies to capitalism's recuperation of radical body liberation that at one point was present during the 60s, and the leftist sentiments in this script were expressed back then as well. In addition to public demonstrations held called Fat-Ins, a fat man named Lou Louderback wrote a column for the Saturday evening newspaper called More People Should Be Fat. And Lou makes so many great points that it's overwhelming. He highlights many of the structural realities of fatness existing in American culture, how it specifically affects fat men who feel marginalized because of it, and how fat is framed as this deathly, sickly state of being, where the fats are expected to drop dead at any moment, and also seemingly persevere so much that there needs to be an effort to kill them. What's ironic about this is that fat, ironically, according to studies, helps you live longer because it provides cushioning when your bones grow brittle in old age because of the strong muscle that fat has beneath it, and that those thick layers of muscle can actually help you survive heart attacks. How the tables have turned. Body positivity is a nice sentiment, but fat liberation is radical. Fat's been collectively demonized due to colonial eugenics and the Protestant obsession with purity influencing how we navigate our lives within capitalism. That's where the desperation to get rid of it comes from, and why it continues to be a high-level threat, despite diet culture being the norm, and including the fact that most people on average are weight cycling and have some form of disordered eating, especially if they're fat and poor. How you feel about yourself and your body were chosen for you. Centuries of God-fearing and flesh-repulsed white men decided that non-normative bodies were egregores for sin, to condition us to think that the good, proper, and civilized thing to do was to forgo our cultures and our bodies to fit into some white supremacist fantasy, and to force generations of our family and our friends to assimilate to it, and have destroyed and colonized what our bodies are naturally supposed to be. Fat is radical.
A lot of what we do in the Fat Underground is informational, because it's real important that we know that we're not crazy and that information has been suppressed. But one of the most important parts of the Fat Underground is sharing our pain with each other and sharing what's happened to us, the stories that nobody ever hears. because we're too embarrassed and because we think we're too crazy, we're the only ones, until we find out that there are millions of us out there. A lot of my pain has to do with doctors. When I was 14, we were on a camping trip and I got a pain in my side. And I kept that pain in my side for 2 days without telling anybody much about it. And finally, when I had to go to bed, my mother made me go to bed, and I said, you know, Ma, it's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. I don't want to go to the doctor. And I refused to go to the doctor for like 2.5 days. And finally had to be taken to the hospital. My mother physically dragged me out of the house to go to the hospital. Of course, it turned out that I had a ruptured appendix that had turned gangrenous because I'd waited so long. And the reason that I waited so long was because the last time I'd been to the doctor, he had put me on a diet, and I hadn't lost any weight. And I knew that what I had was serious. I could feel it in my body, but it felt a lot more serious to go to that doctor not having lost weight than to go in the hospital with a gangrenous appendix. Because there wasn't a whole lot to live for anyway. Years later, I started having back problems. I had these terrible attacks of pain in my back. And so I went to a doctor who charged me $15 and didn't examine me, and sat there across from me and said, well, you know, as long as you're fat, you've got to expect things like that to happen. And I said to him, I'd like maybe a little more coherent explanation of what's happening to my body. And he said, well, you know, fat women, what happens to you? You're going to have to expect pain there, and you're going to have a lot more things coming. And I went through that with a couple of doctors. Of course, it turned out later that I had a congenital malformation in my back and my bone structure that I inherited from my mother. But then I spent like 2 years going from doctor to doctor and trying to lose weight, and it not helping when I lost weight, and thinking that I was crazy, and being real hurt when they wouldn't even want to examine me because they didn't want to look at my body. I once was raped and sat in this little cubicle with a curtain and listened to 2 male doctors outside who, of course, after 5 hours of waiting, 2 doctors came at once. They stood and argued over who was going to have to examine me because they didn't want to touch me, and talking about my stomach and how my genitals were probably fat and my vagina was probably fat, and making jokes about it. And I sat in there with dried blood all over me and listened to that.